She wasn't loud. She wasn't angry. She didn't come in demanding anything. Just a black woman, sharp coat, calm eyes, holding a check, nothing more. And yet the moment she stepped inside that bank, the air shifted. The stares started. The questions sharpened. The smiles vanished. One by one, they picked her apart like she didn't belong, scrutinized her ID, mocked her signature, treated her like a scammer who got too bold. What they didn't realize was that the woman they were dragging through the dirt didn't need to shout to be powerful. She already owned the floor they were standing on. This is not a story about revenge. It's about what happens when arrogance meets reality, and reality signs your paychecks. Think you've seen the twist? You haven't. Hit that like, follow for the full series, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's talk. Who do you think she really is? The wind hit the glass doors of Harridan Bank like a warning. Zora Langston stepped inside, shaking the late autumn chill from her coat, the scent of damp leaves clinging to her scarf. The polished lobby was quiet, orderly, with muted lighting and an air of forced warmth. It wasn't a friendly place, but Zora hadn't come for comfort. She had come to make a deposit. It should have been simple. She clutched the envelope inside her bag a little tighter, knowing it contained a reimbursement check from Langston Group Holdings for $15,000. A sizable transaction, but not unusual in her line of work. She moved with a deliberate calm that had taken years to perfect. Head high, steps measured, eyes forward. Her boots clicked softly on the marble tiles as she crossed the floor to the only open teller window. Behind the glass sat a woman in a stiff maroon blouse, her hair tied back too tight, her mouth locked in a perpetual scowl. Her nameplate read Shanda Penrose. Zora stopped at the counter and offered a brief, polite smile. "Good morning," she said. She slid the check and her driver's license under the glass in a neat, practiced motion. "I'd like to deposit this into my account." Shanda barely looked up. "Sunglasses off," she snapped. Zora blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." Shanda pointed lazily. "Take the sunglasses off. I need to see your face." Zora hadn't realized she was still wearing them. She reached up and pulled them off without protest, folding the thin arms carefully and slipping them into her purse. "Sorry," she said softly. "Didn't mean to be rude." Shanda squinted at her ID, then leaned back and crossed her arms. "And the scarf too. I need to see everything if I'm going to verify your identity." Zora hesitated. The scarf wrapped around her head wasn't religious. It was practical, meant to keep the biting wind out, but the implication was clear. Slowly, she unwrapped it and folded it into her bag. Shanda finally took the check between two fingers, holding it like it might be contaminated. "Langston Group Holdings?" she asked, tone heavy with suspicion. Zora nodded. "That's my employer." "And you are what?" "The assistant." "I'm in finance," Zora replied, her voice calm but firm. Shanda turned the check over, running a counterfeit pen across the back with a dramatic flair. "That's a lot of money for a finance assistant." Zora didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, breathing steadily, gripping the handle of her purse a little tighter. Shanda frowned and tapped on her keyboard with pointed, deliberate strokes. "What's this for?" she asked. "It's a reimbursement check. I used my card for corporate travel expenses last quarter." Shanda raised an eyebrow. "How convenient. You use your own card, then get a nice big check back. Must be nice." Zora's jaw tightened. "It's part of my job." Shanda sighed. "People think they can just waltz in here with a printed check and expect it to clear. You'd be surprised how many people try to pull that. It's not printed. It's issued by our finance office and drawn from the company's operating account." "We'll see about that," Shanda said. She looked down again at the ID. "You're going to have to speak up, by the way. You're mumbling." "I'm not mumbling," Zora replied, careful to keep her tone neutral. "I'm speaking clearly." "Sure you are." Shanda stood up, walked away from the terminal without another word, and disappeared behind a frosted door labeled Employees Only. Zora stood at the window, alone. A man in line behind her shifted his weight and muttered, "Unbelievable," but she couldn't tell if it was aimed at her or the delay. She didn't turn around. Minutes passed. Shanda returned with a clipboard and a young teller with unsure eyes and a pale face. Shanda said something to her under her breath, and they both looked at Zora. Then the younger woman nodded and quickly walked away. Shanda sat back down. "We're going to have to hold this check for further verification," she said, loud enough for the line to hear. "There's some inconsistencies in the signature." Zora's heart skipped. "What inconsistencies?" "Doesn't match the style from previous transactions," Shanda replied. "And we don't have a strong account history on file. It's safer to run it through fraud protocols. The account is new because we changed banks last month." "Doesn't matter," Shanda said, shrugging. "It still has to be flagged." "Could I speak to the branch manager?" Zora asked. Shanda tilted her head. "He's not available. Lunch break. You're welcome to come back later, or you can sit over there while we make a few calls." Zora stood motionless. "You have my ID. You have the check. The account is real. And we're doing our job," Shanda replied with a cold smile. "You'd want us to be thorough if this was someone else's check, right?" Zora turned and walked to the waiting area without another word. She sat down on the faux leather bench, her back straight, hands folded in her lap. Across the room, a man held up his phone subtly, filming. They were talking about her, laughing at her, judging her presence as illegitimate. Her thoughts were interrupted when Shanda suddenly raised her voice. "I need everyone to be patient," she announced, waving the check theatrically above her head like a flag of suspicion. "We're currently handling a high-risk verification." Zora's heart sank. There had been no need to involve the room, no reason to announce her business to strangers, but Shanda had done so with intention. She had turned a routine transaction into a spectacle, and Zora, sitting there silent and alone, was now the show. The line of customers shuffled forward slowly, murmuring amongst themselves. A heavy-set man in his late 60s, wearing a trucker cap and flannel coat, stepped out of line and peered toward Zora with squinted eyes. "High risk," he said, smirking. "Let me guess. Another welfare scam." A few chuckles rippled through the line. Zora closed her eyes briefly, forcing down the sting in her throat. Her stomach tightened, a coil of shame twisting inside her. She had done nothing to deserve this, nothing. But the weight of humiliation pressed against her ribs like concrete. Shanda chuckled under her breath, her eyes not on the man, but clearly approving of the joke. "We take fraud seriously here," she said, holding the check up once again as if to reinforce the point. "Can't just let anyone walk in and move that kind of money." Zora stood slowly, instinct pulling her upright even though she had no plan. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible. "That's a valid check. I have ID. I verified my account." Shanda looked up with mock surprise. "Oh, you're still here," she said loudly. "I told you, we're still verifying. You're welcome to wait." Quietly. The way she said it, quietly, struck Zora harder than anything else. It wasn't just about protocol. It was about putting her in her place. Zora opened her mouth to respond, but Shanda held up a hand dramatically. "Please take your seat, ma'am. We're not finished." A few more people had entered the bank now, drawn by the noise. Some craned their necks to see who the commotion was about. Others rolled their eyes and returned to their phones. The man in the flannel coat stepped to the side of the line and muttered, "You'd think she was getting audited by the IRS." Another added, "These people always think rules don't apply to them." Zora tried to breathe deeply, but her body wouldn't obey. Her chest ached. Her face burned. The humiliation clung to her like smoke. She looked toward the camera mounted in the ceiling. It blinked silently, watching everything, recording nothing that would matter. Shanda picked up the phone on her desk and dialed an internal extension. "Yeah," she said into the receiver. "I need a supervisor to review a flagged deposit." "No, it's a check. 15 grand. "No, the name's Langston." "Yeah, Langston Group Holdings." "Yep. She says she works there." Another pause. "No, I haven't called corporate. I'm not wasting time on that unless it clears." She hung up and looked directly at Zora, still waiting on approval. These things take time. Then, turning to the line, she added, "We're almost done here, folks. Thanks for your patience." The sarcasm in her voice was thick, unmistakable. The passive crowd was no longer passive. They were participants in Zora's public shaming, emboldened by Shanda's attitude and their own assumptions. One woman scoffed, "15,000? Please. I work all year to make that." A young man near the back laughed. "Maybe I should show up in a suit and hand Em a fake check. See if I get VIP treatment." Zora clenched her jaw, her fists curling tight at her sides. She wanted to scream, to shout, to throw the truth in their faces, but no one would listen. Not here. Not like this. She was the outsider in a room full of people who had already made up their minds. Shanda turned to her coworker and whispered something, then deliberately flipped the check over again, inspecting the back as though it might reveal some damning secret. "Look at this," she said just loud enough to be overheard. "Signature barely matches the ID. It's too smooth. Probably copied." "Copied," Zora repeated, her voice thin with disbelief. "You're saying I forged a corporate check for my employer?" Shanda didn't reply. She simply stared, her expression flat and unapologetic. Zora's breath caught in her throat. There was nothing she could say that would change the way they saw her now. Not with the jokes, not with the laughter, not with Shanda turning suspicion into public theater. She turned to look at the glass doors of the bank, wondering if walking out was worse than staying. Could she go back to the office and explain this? Could she say she had been humiliated, accused, stripped of dignity, all while simply trying to deposit her own paycheck? Tried to wait out the insult and let the facts speak for themselves. But facts didn't matter here. Only assumptions did. And the assumptions had already turned her into a liar. At the teller window, Shanda Penrose continued playing to the crowd. She raised the check into the fluorescent lighting again, tilting it back and forth as if it might suddenly sprout the word fraudulent across the ink. Then, with exaggerated care, she pulled open a drawer and removed a fat yellow counterfeit detector pen. Zora recognized it immediately. The same model their company used in the petty cash department. Useful, yes, but limited in its ability. Mostly symbolic. A prop for appearances. But in Shanda's hands, it became a weapon. "Let's just do a quick little test," she said, her voice thick with sarcasm and performance. She held the check high, slowly dragging the pen across it as she looked sideways toward her coworker. Wouldn't want to miss something important. Then, after a pause, she smirked. "Oops, looks fake to me." The words hit Zora like a slap. Every customer in the room seemed to lift their heads a little higher. Someone let out a low whistle. The man in the flannel muttered, "Knew it." A woman near the exit said, "Typical." Shanda casually dropped the check back onto the counter. It fluttered for a moment before settling, like it no longer belonged anywhere. Zora rose from her seat slowly. Her hands were trembling, but she held her posture. "That pen doesn't prove anything," she said, voice tight. "Those detectors aren't definitive. The check is real. Call the issuing bank or my company." "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Shanda snapped, not looking at her. "If you're so confident, you won't mind us double-checking with the fraud unit." She leaned toward her coworker, a younger teller named Lacey, and said just loud enough to be overheard, "Watch the lady. I'm calling for backup." Lacey's eyes widened. She looked toward Zora, then toward the growing crowd, and hesitated. "Shanda, maybe we should just do what I said," Shanda hissed, grabbing the phone from her desk. "Get Collins up here. Tell him it's urgent." Lacey nodded nervously and stepped around the counter, taking a position near the end of the line. She didn't look at Zora. Couldn't. Zora stared at the check still sitting on the desk. It hadn't changed. The account number was still correct. The signature was still hers. The bank logo embossed in its upper right corner still gleamed faintly in the light. But now it had been publicly declared a fake. A performance had been staged around it. And once labeled, perception became truth. Shanda turned away from the phone and smoothed her blouse, clearly enjoying the sense of authority. "Assistant manager's on his way," she announced. "Let's see what he thinks about all this." A wave of murmurs rippled through the bank. People shifted in line, whispered to one another. Some glanced back at Zora, Others simply stared like she was something between entertainment and inconvenience. The man in the flannel coat clapped his hands once and said, "Well, this day just got interesting." Another voice muttered, "Why do they always push it?" Zora felt her ears ring. Her legs itched to move, to run, to disappear into the city beyond the glass doors. But she stood still. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not flee like someone guilty, even if every detail of this moment screamed that she was already judged. "You said you were in finance?" Shanda asked suddenly. "What kind of finance job gives you checks like this?" Zora didn't answer. The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation cloaked in disbelief. And it was rhetorical, meant to imply, "Women like you don't earn that kind of money." Zora looked down at her shoes, black leather, polished. She remembered buying them in New York last spring, just before her promotion. She remembered walking into that store and thinking, "I need to look like I belong in the rooms I've earned my way into." She remembered the weight of those words now, how foolish they felt in the face of today. Lacey shifted on her feet, visibly uncomfortable. Shanda, however, seemed to grow taller with every minute. "Where's that manager?" she asked loudly. "I'm not going to sit here babysitting a fraud case all day." Zora's hands balled into fists at her sides. Her breathing was slow, measured, practiced. But her throat burned. Her vision blurred. Not from tears, but from rage held too long, without release. The bank doors opened. A man in a navy blazer walked in from the side hallway, scanning the room. His name tag read Collins. He spotted Shanda and made his way over. "What's going on?" he asked. Shanda turned and launched into a rehearsed report. Client presented a large check. Signature doesn't match prior account details. No substantial account history. Counterfeit pen flagged it. Client's uncooperative. Zora took a breath and said, "I'm not uncooperative. I've followed every request." Collins turned to her. "Ma'am, we'll take a look. Just have a seat for now." Again, Zora asked, voice brittle, "You're asking me to sit down while you decide if I'm a criminal?" Collins didn't answer. He just motioned toward Lacey, who nodded and walked quickly back behind the teller desk. Shanda turned to her drawer and began pulling out a red envelope. "Let's get the paperwork started," she muttered. "We'll fill out a preliminary fraud form just in case." "Just in case of what?" Zora demanded. "Just in case your assumptions are wrong." Collins frowned. "Let's keep this civil." "No," Zora said, her voice rising for the first time. "Let's keep this honest. You haven't verified anything. You haven't called my company. You haven't even checked the issuing bank. You saw my face and decided I was suspicious." Zora's check still lay on the counter, limp and dismissed. A moment later, the assistant manager Collins returned, this time holding a manila folder and a forced expression of civility. "Ms. Langston," he said, keeping his voice flat and official, "would you mind stepping into our client consultation room for a moment? It's just to clear up some details, privately." The words were smooth on the surface, but Zora heard what they really meant. She was being removed, not helped, not assisted, segregated, pushed away from public view under the illusion of professionalism. Zora rose, chin high despite the fire in her chest, and followed him through the bank's main floor to a glass-walled room on the right. The blinds were half-drawn, not closed, leaving full visibility into the space from the lobby. The message was clear. Everyone would be allowed to watch her, but she wouldn't be allowed to speak to anyone. As she stepped in, Collins gestured to a small round table and 2 chairs. Zora sat, placing her bag in her lap protectively. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them. Collins remained standing. "I need to review your ID again," he said, holding out his hand. Zora hesitated. "You already have it." "We need a fresh copy," he said flatly, "for documentation." She reached into her bag and handed it over. Collins left the room, leaving the door open behind him. Zora sat in silence, fully visible through the glass. Customers walked by and glanced in, their expressions vacant, some curious, others clearly judging. They saw a black woman in a locked room at a bank, being observed. The implications were loud, even if no one said a word. A few whispered outside. Laughter followed. Shanda's voice drifted from the teller line, too loud not to be intentional. "Look at this ID," she said, chuckling. She must have printed it at home. That photo's got more blur than a driver's license from Craigslist. Someone at another desk laughed, a wet snorting sound of agreement. Zora heard it, every syllable. Her stomach tightened, as if her insides had been punched. The weight of it wasn't just in the insult. It was in the ease of it, the casual cruelty, the normalcy with which she had become the punchline. She looked down at the table. It was immaculate, soulless, like the bank. Cold surface, sharp corners, polished only for show. Minutes passed. Collins returned and set her ID down on the table, sliding it back across to her like it was part of an evidence log. "We're still working on verifying the check," he said, eyes avoiding hers. "We've contacted the issuing bank, but it may take time." Zora didn't move. "Have you contacted my company?" she asked quietly. "Langston Group Holdings?" "That's not our priority," he replied. "The check's the issue, not the employer." "They're the same," she replied, her voice gaining friction. "My name's on the check. It came from our finance office. The signature matches the bank records. What more do you need?" "We just have to be cautious," Collins said. "This isn't personal." Zora gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think this hasn't happened before?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "We're just trying to do things by the book. If the book says I don't belong here, maybe you're reading the wrong one." Collins didn't answer. He stepped out again, murmuring something to Shanda, who looked toward the consultation room with a smirk. "Still hasn't broken down crying?" she asked. Zora's ears burned. A woman in the customer line turned, glanced toward the room, then looked away quickly, pretending not to have heard. No one said a word. No one questioned it. Collins returned, this time with a clipboard in hand. "We're going to need a signed statement from you," he said, "to document your version of events." "Version?" Zora asked. "I walked into your bank. I handed over my check. I provided ID. That's the only version." "It's a formality," he said, placing the clipboard on the table. "Just confirming the transaction details." Zora took the pen and stared at the empty lines. The paper itself was an accusation. It read, "Suspected fraudulent activity, client statement." No matter what she wrote, she was already labeled. Every box, every field, every signature was another layer of assumed guilt. Still, she signed, not because she accepted it, but because she had to finish what she started. She wasn't walking away without closure. Collins took the form and left without a word. Alone again, Zora exhaled slowly, not to calm herself, but to keep from shaking apart. Through the glass, she could see Shanda leaning against her teller station, chatting with another customer, laughing easily, as if none of this mattered, as if Zora didn't matter. Time crawled. Zora wasn't sure how long she sat there, 20 minutes, maybe more. No updates, no apology, just isolation. She pulled out her phone and opened her email. The screen blinked to life. She thought about sending a message to her assistant, alerting someone at the office. But what could she write? That she had been detained at her own bank? Her check remained behind the teller counter, untouched, unloved, dismissed like its owner. Her ID had gone through a round of unauthorized photocopying, and her voice, reasoned and controlled, had done nothing to change the course of this manufactured narrative. Zora had stayed quiet through the insults, through the laughter outside the glass walls, through the unrelenting humiliation. But something inside her was beginning to fray. She needed contact. She needed someone who could verify what she was saying. With her phone still tucked in her bag, she leaned toward the door and stepped partially out into the hallway. She wasn't escaping. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't even angry, not yet. She just wanted to call her office. One voice from someone on the company finance team could dissolve this entire situation in minutes. Collins stood nearby, conferring again with Shanda. When he noticed her movement, he walked briskly over, tone clipped and urgent. "Ma'am," he said, holding out a hand as if she were approaching a crime scene. "You'll need to remain in the consultation room until this is resolved." Zora held her ground, firm but composed. I'd like to make a call to my office. I have a right to contact someone from my company to verify this transaction." Collins gave a dry chuckle, though his eyes didn't mirror humor. "This isn't a courtroom, Ms. Langston. You're not under arrest." His voice dropped slightly, almost a whisper, but still sharp enough to cut. "Not yet." Zora's breath caught. "Not yet." The words rang in her ears like a verdict. They were meant to remind her that she was not in control, that she didn't hold power here, that even without charges, she had already been labeled guilty. She stepped backward into the glass room slowly, her expression unreadable. Collins turned and gestured toward the front entrance. Moments later, a uniformed security guard entered the branch, mid-40s, stocky, with a badge that meant little and a taser strapped to his belt like it made him something more. He walked across the bank like a storm cloud, planting himself directly outside the consultation room door, arms crossed, eyes forward. He didn't speak to Zora. He didn't need to. His presence was the message. Sit still. Stay silent. Know your place. Inside the teller area, Shanda reached down beneath her counter and pulled out a file folder stuffed with thick red border documents. She flipped them open on the desk with dramatic precision, the pages crackling loudly enough to turn heads. The top sheet read fraudulent transaction report in bold black type. She didn't glance toward Zora, but her voice was loud enough to be heard across the lobby. "We're going to need full documentation now," she said to Lacey, who stood nearby, visibly conflicted. "Full witness statement. Scan her ID again. Record the times, transaction amount, suspicious behavior. All of it." Lacey hesitated. "Isn't that premature?" she asked, her voice small. "The check hasn't even been confirmed. That's why we document," Shanda snapped. "If it turns out to be real, fine. But if not, we're covered." Lacey looked toward the glass room. Zora sat upright, motionless, hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked like a woman trying not to shatter. But the damage had already been done. Shanda turned to her terminal, typing quickly. Each keystroke sounded like a nail in a coffin. "We'll file preliminary suspicion and lock the funds pending verification. If it clears, it clears. If not, the paperwork's ready for the authorities." Lacey nodded slowly and turned away, her posture hunched as she disappeared into the back office. Collins stepped to the teller counter, took one of the forms Shanda had filled out, and slid it into a side folder marked Client Discrepancy Hold. The title glared in bold at the top, designed not to clarify, but to indict. Inside the glass room, Zora shifted her gaze to the security guard outside. His eyes didn't meet hers. He was focused on nothing and everything at once, the kind of hired vigilance used to silence, not protect. She leaned forward, speaking through the open door. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of." The guard didn't answer. Collins returned a moment later, holding another sheet of paper. "Ms. Langston, we'll need you to review this document. It outlines the discrepancy procedures per corporate policy." He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table, as if sliding it toward a suspect in an interrogation room. Zora picked it up without a word. The form was vague and filled with sterile legal jargon, wording designed to absolve the bank from liability while framing the customer as the problem. It required a signature at the bottom acknowledging receipt and understanding of the transactional dispute process. She didn't sign it. She looked up. "When will someone from my company be contacted?" "That depends," Collins replied. "We usually wait until verification from the issuing bank." "You mean the same bank I've been with for the last 4 years?" "It's not personal," he said again, though now even he seemed tired of repeating the lie. Zora stood. Her voice shook, but only slightly. "You've refused to confirm my identity through direct contact. You've mocked my ID. You've allowed your staff to degrade me. You've stationed a guard at the door like I'm a threat. And now you're preparing to file fraudulent documents against me without any proof." "Ma'am, you need to calm down," Collins said immediately. "Raising your voice isn't helping." Zora wasn't raising her voice. She hadn't even moved. But the warning came anyway, preloaded and reflexive, because a woman like her wasn't allowed to speak clearly and still be considered composed. Every word she said was interpreted as defiance, every breath a challenge. He hadn't moved much, But his hand now rested closer to his belt where his taser sat snug in its holster, a silent suggestion that her place here was conditional. Zora had been isolated, insulted, and denied the basic act of verifying her identity. Her confidence, already dented by the previous encounters, now felt like a costume stretched over bones that ached from holding themselves upright. Collins hadn't returned. Lacey had disappeared into the back office after mumbling something about compliance policies. Shanda remained at the teller window, her voice loud enough to leak through the air like smoke from a brush fire, always saying just enough to be heard but never enough to be called outright abuse. The people in the line had thinned, but those who remained continued to glance in her direction, some with disgust, others with amused detachment, as if she were a malfunctioning part of the machine they had to tolerate before their real business could be conducted. Zora finally stood and walked slowly to the door, not in defiance, but with the slow deliberation of someone determined to retain any last piece of control. The security guard looked at her, but didn't speak. She looked beyond him to the teller counter. "I'd like my check back," she said, not raising her voice. "You've refused to verify it. I'll handle it elsewhere." Her tone wasn't angry. It was resignation wrapped in measured breath. Shanda turned toward her, expression unreadable for half a second before her mouth curved into a smile so practiced it felt sculpted. "Oh, now you want it back," she said, lifting the check delicately from a pile of paperwork. "After all this trouble?" Zora said nothing. She simply waited, still and silent, determined not to give Shanda the rise she clearly desired. The teller turned toward her station, opened a desk drawer, and pulled out a red rubber stamp. The sound of her opening the ink pad echoed against the walls. With a slow, almost ritualistic movement, she placed the check on the counter and pressed the stamp hard against it. The smack of impact was loud. When she lifted her hand, the check bore a harsh, unmistakable label in red: "Rejected." The ink bled slightly at the edges, as if the word had been burned into the paper. Then, using only 2 fingers, Shanda slid the check under the glass back toward Zora like it was a napkin someone had sneezed on. Zora reached for it, but stopped short when Shanda said, loudly enough for the entire front lobby to hear, "People like you always try this. Big checks. Big stories. No proof." Her words were sharp, clean, and meant to carve. There was a moment of silence in the bank, and then someone near the coffee station let out a low whistle. Another voice muttered, "She should be grateful they're not calling the cops." Shanda leaned in closer to the glass, eyes sharp, mouth twisted with a kind of victorious pity. "You should probably leave before we decide this is an attempted scam and notify law enforcement. It's not too late to escalate this." Zora's spine stiffened. Her face didn't move, but her fingers tightened slightly around the edges of the check. She wasn't holding a piece of paper anymore. She was holding the embodiment of every microaggression, every slight, every time she'd had to overperform just to be considered enough. She held a document that had been stripped of its value not because of its numbers, but because of her name, her skin, her presence. "I've done nothing wrong," Zora said, voice low but deliberate. "You have no right to accuse me of fraud. You have no right to humiliate me. We're just doing our job." Shanda replied with a shrug. "You should know how that works. Or maybe you don't." The words hit Zora in a place she didn't even know was open. She could feel the eyes on her from every angle. Not one person had stepped in. Not one customer had spoken up. No ally emerged from behind the desks or from the hallways of power in this institution. She stood there completely alone in the middle of a system that had already processed her as a threat and was now daring her to respond accordingly, to lose control, to give them an excuse. She wouldn't. She picked up the check, now marred with the red stamp, folded it carefully, and slid it into her bag. Then she lifted her chin and took a single step back. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice almost painfully polite. "I'll have my legal team follow up." The room seemed to freeze for a second. Even Shanda paused, the satisfaction on her face briefly replaced by something more cautious. But she recovered quickly. "Of course," she said, her tone lilting again. "You're free to leave." But next time, maybe don't walk in with a fake check and expect us to roll out the red carpet." The guard outside didn't move. He just watched as Zora turned and walked out of the consultation room, through the lobby where customers still whispered behind hands and smirking mouths. Each step felt like it echoed louder than it should have, but Zora didn't break stride. She passed through the glass doors and out into the winter air, the cold cutting across her cheeks like absolution. But her shoulders didn't drop. Her breath didn't ease. The damage had been done. She reached into her bag and removed the folded check, staring at the red words stamped across it, the symbol of a humiliation too personal to explain. She had not shouted. She had not broken down. She had not wept. At precisely 8:42, the front doors parted again and Zora Langston stepped inside. She wore no sunglasses this time, no scarf. Her coat was deep navy, double-breasted, sharp at the shoulders. Her heels struck the floor with clean authority. In her left hand, a leather portfolio clutched against her hip. In her right, she carried only a single card, held between two fingers. Her expression gave nothing away. The bank's lobby wasn't crowded yet, just a few customers in line and the usual staff behind the counter. Shanda Penrose stood behind the main teller window, tapping slowly at her keyboard, brows drawn low in practiced boredom. Her eyes flicked toward the door, and for a moment they lingered. She recognized Zora immediately. Her posture shifted imperceptibly but distinctly. She didn't move toward the consultation room. She didn't move at all. Instead, she watched. Zora didn't acknowledge her. She walked straight past the front queue toward a man standing near the account services office, a tall figure in a charcoal suit, his ID badge clipped to his breast pocket, bearing the Harridan Bank logo and a title in bold: Regional Director, Davenport District. He had arrived 10 minutes prior, unannounced, causing subtle tension among staff. Unplanned visits from regional directors never signaled routine check-ins. They meant something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. He had yet to explain his purpose. His name was Thomas Elridge, mid-50s, with steel-colored hair, deliberate speech, and the kind of presence that made people straighten their backs. When Zora approached, his face lit up with recognition. Not surprise, not confusion, recognition. She handed him the card silently. He accepted it, glanced at the name, and nodded once. No words were exchanged. Then he turned to her fully, offering his hand. She shook it calm and firm. Shanda saw it all. Her eyes narrowed. From her post, she leaned subtly forward, watching closely. There was no smile on Elridge's face, but there was respect. Mutuality. Zora spoke quietly, too low to be heard over the lobby's soft bustle. Elridge listened carefully, occasionally nodding, never interrupting. Then he gestured toward the private offices on the left, away from the teller counters, toward a conference room usually reserved for audits or high-stakes client meetings. As they began to walk, Shanda straightened up. Something prickled beneath her skin, a wrongness she couldn't explain. She glanced toward Lacey, who shrugged nervously, then looked away. Collins wasn't in yet. No one else on the floor had any clue what was happening, but Shanda knew enough to sense the shift. Zora wasn't here to argue today. She wasn't asking for approval or permission. She was moving with purpose and escorted by the most powerful man in the district. Inside the conference room, Elridge closed the door gently behind them, then walked to the far end of a long table. Zora placed her portfolio on the table, opened it, and slid 3 documents forward. Each one bore the Langston Group Holdings crest in the top left corner, and beneath that, her name. Not as an employee, not as a department head, but as the Chief Financial Officer. Her title was printed clearly in bold letters, followed by a signature line she had signed herself. Her hands moved without hesitation as she aligned the papers with clean precision. Elridge skimmed the first page, eyes narrowing not in confusion, but focus. He nodded slowly. "Understood," he said after a moment. "Do you want to file the complaint formally through legal, or would you prefer internal corrective action first?" "Internal first," Zora replied, her tone even, "but only if it's direct, immediate, and public." Elridge didn't flinch. "It will be." Meanwhile, outside the room, Shanda began pacing behind the teller window. She hadn't taken another customer since Zora walked in. Her eyes stayed locked on the closed door. Her usual smirk had vanished. For the first time in years, uncertainty crept into her gut. Not fear, not yet, but unease. A wrong move had been made, she realized. But she didn't know which one. She didn't know that Zora Langston not only worked for Langston Group Holdings, but that the company itself had a direct corporate relationship with Harridan Bank, handled through Elridge's own district, and that Zora's signature didn't just belong on a check. It approved salaries. It authorized wire transfers. It funded operating accounts, including this branch's monthly corporate payroll cycle. That knowledge hadn't reached the teller line yet, but the silence spreading through the floor began to suggest something deeper than a routine meeting. Lacey, biting her lip, leaned over to one of the junior tellers and whispered, "Is she someone important?" The younger woman glanced up. "She's with the regional director." "I know that," Lacey hissed. "But why?" Neither of them had an answer. Back inside the conference room, Zora closed the portfolio and sat back, her posture composed, eyes steady. Elridge tapped the folder once, then stood. "I'll speak to them now," he said. Zora didn't nod. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. As Elridge exited the room, he didn't stop to alert the branch manager or request assistance. He walked directly to the teller line, and when he reached it, he said just one name, Shanda. She turned too quickly. "Sir." "Step away from the counter," Elridge said. His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. Every word carried finality. Shanda blinked. "Is something now?" Her hands trembled as she closed out her terminal. Her presence, poised and unshaken, cut through the sterile air like a blade. She walked with measured calm into the very space where just one day prior, she had been humiliated, doubted, and discarded. Her heels struck the tile in an even rhythm, each step a quiet declaration that she no longer moved beneath anyone's assumption of her worth. Behind her, Regional Director Thomas Elridge followed, his face unreadable, but his pace purposeful. The two moved as a unit, not adversarial, not superior and subordinate, but aligned, an unspoken recognition that what was about to happen was not about vengeance, but about truth. Zora stopped in the center of the bank floor, directly between the teller counters and the consultation room, where she had been detained like a suspect, where her ID had been mocked and her check defaced. The same space where her dignity had been slowly eroded in front of smirking strangers and silent staff. Now she stood there again, not alone, not passive, not asking. Elridge stepped beside her and adjusted the button of his blazer before addressing the room. His voice, though calm, carried with it the weight of consequence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, eyes scanning the staff behind the counters, "this is Ms. Zora Langston. She is the Chief Financial Officer of Langston Group Holdings." He paused just long enough to let that sentence settle. "Our largest corporate client." Murmurs rose from the back of the room. A pin could have dropped and been heard in the farthest corner. No one moved. Every employee looked toward Zora now, not with suspicion, not with dismissiveness, but with dawning realization. Lacey's face went pale. One of the junior tellers gasped audibly and quickly covered her mouth. Shanda Penrose stood motionless near her station, where just a day before she had stamped a red rejected across Zora's valid check, joked about fake IDs, and laughed at the idea of her having any real authority. Now she was frozen, eyes wide, as if her breath had caught in her throat and refused to let go. Zora turned her head slowly and met Shanda's gaze. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. Her eyes were calm, steady, and piercing. "I signed your paychecks." The silence that followed was complete. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of stunned understanding. The very idea that the woman so easily discarded had in fact been the one holding financial authority over them shattered the artificial hierarchy built by assumption and prejudice. The same assumptions that had allowed Shanda to publicly question her identity, mock her credentials, and invite a guard to stand watch over her like a threat. Shanda's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked around the room, but no one came to her defense. No one smirked. No one chuckled. Her authority, once inflated by casual cruelty, now shrank beneath the truth standing before her. Elridge continued, Langston Group Holdings is responsible for one of the largest financial accounts handled through this branch. Ms. Langston's signature authorizes payroll, development funds, and corporate transactions totaling over $47 million annually. He let the number ring out, not to impress, but to correct, to remind everyone that Zora Langston had never needed to prove herself to this bank. They had needed to prove themselves to her. Yesterday, he added, Ms. Langston was treated in a manner not only unprofessional, but unacceptable. She was denied verification of her identity despite presenting valid credentials, subjected to public humiliation, and accused of fraud with no supporting evidence. This happened in front of customers, on your cameras, with full participation from branch staff. He didn't raise his voice, but the censure in his tone made it feel louder than a shout. This behavior will not stand, and it will not be ignored. Zora remained silent. She didn't need to explain anything. She had already done what needed to be done. Her power was not in her words now. It was in her composure, her presence, her clarity, her grace in the face of casual dehumanization. She didn't want revenge. She wanted accountability. And in this moment, the weight of it began to settle across every corner of the room. Shanda finally moved, her voice barely audible. I didn't know, you didn't ask, Zora replied, still calm. You assumed. I was just doing my job, Shanda said, though the words sounded hollow now. You turned your job into a weapon, Zora said, her voice soft but resolute. You treated my identity as fraud and my dignity as optional. The room remained still. No one moved to comfort Shanda now. No one laughed. No one made excuses. Lacey looked down, shame painted across her face. The security guard from the day before stepped away from the door and quietly returned to his post near the entrance, avoiding Zora's eyes entirely. Elridge cleared his throat. Effective immediately, this branch will undergo a full internal review. Staff involved in yesterday's incident will be placed under formal investigation, pending further action. Corporate training on procedural equity and implicit bias will be mandatory for all employees, starting today. He turned toward Zora. On behalf of Harridan Bank, I apologize for what occurred. It does not reflect our values, and it will be addressed. Zora nodded once, the faintest movement, acknowledging but not accepting the apology just yet. Actions, not words, would determine the value of that promise. She looked once more around the room, at the faces that had judged her, the ones that had dismissed her, the ones that had watched in silence as she was humiliated. Then she turned and walked to the door without another word. Zora's poised, silent reaction and slow retreat from the teller window closed the clip with devastating impact. It was uploaded to a public social media feed by midday and began gaining traction almost immediately. The title read, Bank Exec Humiliated by Her Own Institution. Watch what happens next. Within 12 hours, the post had passed 200,000 views. By morning, it had topped 1 million. The image of Shanda Penrose's face, smirking in mid-sentence, stamp in hand, became a still frame that social justice advocates, business leaders, and casual viewers alike shared with growing outrage. Zora hadn't posted anything herself. She hadn't spoken to the media or issued a statement. But others did. Her company, Langston Group Holdings, released a formal announcement that evening acknowledging the incident and confirming Zora Langston's position as Chief Financial Officer. The statement was brief but powerful. We stand behind Ms. Langston, whose leadership, professionalism, and integrity remain beyond reproach. We are deeply disappointed by the treatment she received while attempting to complete a routine transaction. Our team is reviewing all partnerships and will determine whether continued business with Harridan Bank aligns with our corporate values. That sentence alone sent tremors through Harridan Bank's executive floor. Internal communications exploded overnight. Branch managers were ordered to pull security footage, incident reports, and customer logs. Legal departments scrambled to assess exposure. Marketing teams were called into emergency meetings before dawn to prepare a crisis communication plan. But none of it stopped what came next. By day 3, national outlets picked up the story. Morning news segments featured side-by-side photos, Zora's professional headshot, polished and poised, placed beside Shanda's grainy frame from the video. The juxtaposition spoke volumes without narration. How a CFO was treated like a criminal at her own bank. One headline read, "Assumptions, Power, and Racism in Everyday Transactions," read another. On talk shows, panelists dissected the interaction. Legal analysts described it as a textbook example of implicit bias. Human resources experts highlighted the failure of internal training. Civil rights advocates drew parallels to long-standing institutional prejudice. Meanwhile, Zora received a flood of private messages. Some came from strangers offering support. Others came from colleagues, competitors, and executives across industries, some horrified, some ashamed, all aware they could no longer afford to ignore the quiet, corrosive behaviors that had shaped corporate culture for decades. Shanda, however, woke up to a different reality. Her phone, once a source of casual entertainment and group chats, now buzzed constantly with notifications she hadn't asked for. Her name had been published, her workplace identified. Internet sleuths had connected the dots with ease, and now her name trended alongside hashtags like #BankBias, #JusticeForZora, and #Implicit Racism Exposed. She shut off her phone, then her laptop, but it didn't matter. The messages came anyway. Her personal accounts flooded with vitriol, some of it cruel, some of it righteous, all of it relentless. She didn't leave her apartment for 3 days. She didn't respond to the internal email summoning her to a disciplinary hearing. When she finally returned to work, escorted through the employee entrance by a supervisor, she kept her head down. But silence greeted her more harshly than the noise. Coworkers avoided her. Some wouldn't make eye contact. Others glanced, then quickly looked away. Whispers followed her through every hallway. Lacey, who had once giggled at her jokes, didn't even say hello. Collins barely acknowledged her. On the 4th floor of Harridan Bank's headquarters, a boardroom full of executives stared grimly at a screen that projected stock performance. In red lines and sharp angles, the data told a story that could not be denied. Public trust had eroded. Shareholder confidence wavered. The financial toll, while manageable, signaled a larger truth. Their reputation had taken a hit they could not afford to ignore. The bank's CEO called for a press conference. In a carefully curated statement, he addressed the unacceptable incident at the Davenport branch. Harridan Bank is committed to treating every customer with dignity and respect, he said. We failed in that commitment. We offer our sincerest apologies to Ms. Langston and to all who saw in her story a reflection of their own experiences. We will do better. Behind the scenes, human resources worked overtime. Shanda was suspended indefinitely pending review. An external firm was brought in to audit employee behavior, compliance processes, and bias training programs across all branches. It wasn't just about one teller anymore. It was about the culture that allowed such moments to happen without fear of consequence. At Langston Group Holdings, Zora continued her work without pause. She sat in meetings, approved budgets, mentored young analysts. But everywhere she went, people walked with a little more caution around her, not out of fear, but out of awareness. The quiet acknowledgement that power had always been hers, even when they didn't see it. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly financials, her assistant stepped into the office with an envelope. "This came in for you," he said. It had no return address. Inside was a short letter, handwritten. "I don't expect forgiveness," it began. "I just want you to know I see it now. What I did, what I was part of. I thought I was doing my job, but really, I was just protecting my comfort. I didn't care what it cost you. I'm sorry." 3 months had passed since the clip surfaced. 3 months since the world witnessed a simple banking transaction unravel into a national conversation about bias, dignity, and power. The headlines had shifted, the viral hashtags cooled, and the initial storm of media fury had begun to recede, but its echo remained. The consequences endured, reshaping quiet corners of workplaces, boardrooms, and lunchroom conversations. Harridan Bank, still reeling from the fallout, followed through on its promises. Internal audits swept across branches like cleansing fire. New policies were enacted. Leadership shifted. Mandatory bias training was expanded and no longer a formality. It became immersive, reflective, and for many uncomfortable in the best ways. But real change, the kind that roots itself beyond press statements and camera flashes, often begins in smaller, quieter places. One such place was the basement of a converted community center in Roxbury, where rows of plastic folding chairs filled a narrow room that once served as a storage space for unused school desks. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, and a whiteboard at the front displayed in thick marker, Financial Empowerment Workshop Session 3, Building Credit and Trust. Among the handful of volunteers in the room was a woman with pulled back hair, dressed in a simple navy cardigan and gray slacks, sleeves rolled slightly above the wrist. Her name tag read Shanda Volunteer. She stood near the refreshment table, setting out plastic cups with awkward focus, avoiding eye contact, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. She didn't speak much. When she did, it was soft, thoughtful, never performative. She listened more than she talked, and when she did answer questions from attendees, most of them working mothers, recent immigrants, and students, she didn't lecture. She shared. She told them how credit worked, how to protect themselves from predatory lending, and how to ask questions without apology. She never spoke of where she'd worked before. She didn't need to. Her presence was quieter now, humbled by the months of isolation and accountability, reshaped not by punishment, but by consequence, and the opportunity to reflect. Her suspension from Harridan Bank had turned permanent. She'd never returned. At first, she resisted the change, defensive and bitter, blaming the world for the reaction instead of herself for the action. But time has a way of uncoiling truth in slow, persistent loops. The silence from former colleagues, the emails that went unanswered, the looks in the grocery store, even her own niece's hesitation to speak about the incident. All of it chipped away at the shield she had once carried with smug certainty. And eventually, she stopped defending what she had done. She started asking why she had done it at all. It was during a public library visit, while leafing through a book on restorative justice, that she found an application for local volunteer work focused on economic literacy. She filled it out, not to rebuild her image, but to understand, to start again. And now, here she stood, pouring apple juice into paper cups and explaining APRs to a young woman named Marisol who was trying to get her first credit card. Shanda didn't consider herself reformed. That word felt too neat, too fast. She considered herself learning. Elsewhere, in a much larger venue, Zora Langston stood under the warm lights of a corporate convention hall stage, addressing a crowd of more than 1,000 professionals at the National Equity and Innovation Summit in Atlanta. Her keynote speech, slated as a highlight of the event, followed months of requests, invitations, and inquiries. She had declined most media attention after the incident, choosing silence not out of fear, but because the world often rushed to consume stories of pain faster than it addressed the roots that caused them. But this was different. This was a room full of decision-makers, leaders, people who shaped policy and culture within industries and institutions. And if ever there was a time to speak, not in anger, but in clarity, it was now. Zora stood tall, dressed in a tailored black suit with a single lapel pin bearing the Langston Group crest. Her presence was effortless, but every word carried weight. 3 months ago, she began, I walked into a bank to deposit a reimbursement check. I followed the rules. I presented identification. I waited patiently, and I left that bank not with a successful transaction, but with the echo of every subtle, repeated indignity that people like me are expected to accept without protest. The room was silent, not in discomfort, but in attention. Zora continued, what happened to me is not unique, and that's the tragedy. What's unique is that it was captured, seen, shared, and because of that it was believed. She paused just long enough to let that truth settle, then added, I did not come here for sympathy. I do not need apologies. I came here because real justice isn't about revenge, it's about change. It's about transforming systems so that they no longer rely on the silence of the people they harm. She spoke for 30 minutes, Not once did she raise her voice, but her words moved through the crowd with the force of a storm. She shared strategies for accountability, highlighted hiring biases, emphasized equity in corporate finance, and challenged the crowd to examine not just the systems they worked in, but the assumptions they carried into every room. Her closing line echoed into every corner of the auditorium. Privilege is invisible to those who have it until someone shows them the cost. And the cost is always someone else's dignity. If we are to lead, we must first listen. If we are to fix, we must first believe. The crowd stood in a slow, powerful ovation, not performative, but earned. Later that day, Zora stepped outside onto the quiet balcony of the conference center. The city skyline stretched before her, buildings stacked like timelines, stories layered one atop another. She stood alone, not lonely, but contemplative. Behind her, a voice spoke softly. "Ms. Langston." She turned. A young intern from the summit staff held a folder. "There's a letter here. It was left with your coordinator. No name, just said you'd recognize the handwriting." Zora took it gently. She waited until the intern left before unfolding it. The writing was familiar, slanted right, neat but unsure. Inside, the words were fewer this time. "Thank you for making me see. I won't waste what I've learned." No name, no need. Zora read it once, then folded it again and placed it in her portfolio beside the others. Some people might call it redemption, but to her, it was something deeper. It was proof that change was possible, that shame could become soil, and that the ugliest truths could birth the clearest paths forward. She looked out over the city one last time before turning back inside, the sound of conversations and collaboration rising from the hall behind her. She had more work to do, but for the first time, she didn't carry it alone. The end. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. If you found the story powerful or thought-provoking, consider supporting with a like or following for more. I'd love to hear what you think. What stood out to you in the plot? And how did the journey of these characters hit you personally? Where are you watching or reading this from? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it. Your feedback helps shape what comes next.